Good morning and welcome again to Zip Over with Zack. I am delighted to welcome you once again to my living room for our second episode. For those who haven't watched before, we take big kind of global subjects and make them into relatable, quick 20-minute conversations. We don't have a huge time to go deep, but we really hope to have kind of intricate conversations about issues that really matter. For those who do watch the program regularly, thank you so much and keep watching. We really want to encourage contribution once again. So if at any point you want to talk about the subjects that we're talking about, then do put your questions into the chat and I'll put them to the fantastic guests that I'll be introducing shortly. This week, we're going to be talking about young Londoners, all about the issues that matter to them and their priorities. So if you're a young Londoner, we're particularly keen to hear from you, but everyone is welcome. My name is Zach Polanski. I'm the third Assembly candidate for the Green Party London list, supporting the amazing work of our Green Assembly members, Sean Berry and Caroline Russell. Now, talking about everyone being welcome, just before we start the show today, I want to talk about something that is particularly concerning, and that's the anti-Semitism that's been going on Twitter over the weekend. For those who don't know, a UK rapper started to go on a tirade of lots of anti-Semitic tweets that went on for about 12 hours. These tweets were talking about violence against the Jewish community and comparing our community to the KKK. Now, I say our community as a Jewish man, because this is something that hits me personally. And it's been something that I've been worried about for a long time. And I thank everyone who stood in solidarity against those tweets. The Home Secretary, to her credit, did criticize Twitter and say that she wants them to take swift and more decisive action. The problem our government have here, though, is that Boris Johnson is someone who has talked about watermelon smiles, about tank top bum boys. You can't one day engage in racism, homophobia and transphobia, and the next day pretend that you're a champion of another community. I think it is incumbent on everyone, especially minority communities, to stand in solidarity with each other and speak out. And I want to say a particular thank you to organisations like the Green Party and people like our candidate for Mayor, Sean Berry, who have joined the Twitter boycott and are saying for 48 hours they won't be using Twitter in solidarity. What I want to happen next, though, is a conversation about where we go from here. I think silence is a great first step, but actually we can't be silent forever. And actually, right now, I think we need to be amplifying minority and marginalised voices more than ever before. So on Wednesday, as soon as the ban is over, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., every single hour, I'm going to be tweeting a Jewish voice, an artist, a scientist, a historian, whoever they might be, every hour to celebrate and amplify those voices. I'd encourage you to join in. I'm going to be using the hashtag Amplify. And whether it's a Jewish voice, a black voice, a trans voice, a disabled voice, it doesn't matter whose voice it is. I just think any voices that we often don't hear or are from a marginalised community, we need to be amplifying and make sure we're hearing them louder. Join in. Now, on with the show. Today, as I said, we're going to be talking to young Green voices. Now, within the Green Party, we have a huge campaign movement called the Young Greens, who are a body that, the clue is on the title, are made up of Greens who are younger. Now, they've been amazing in terms of the activism that they bring to the party, the energy, the attention, and the focus, both on campaigning issues and also electorally when we're getting out there and knocking on doors to win votes. Within the Young Green Party is the London Young Greens, who are a smaller body that are specifically there for Londoners. And they've just recently had elections. And I'm delighted not only to congratulate the two new co-chairs, but also to welcome them to the show. So that is Lucy Pegg and George Bellshaw. Welcome to the show, guys. Hey there. Hey, guys. And then shortly, after I've spoken to our new two young Green London co-chairs, I'm also going to be talking to Naranee Ruthra-Rajan, who is a senior programs manager at A New Direction, about what non-profit organisations can be doing to help young people in London. But turning to Lucy and George first, and starting with Lucy, I know that you guys have kind of hit the ground running and are talking about priorities for young people in London. What are your priorities for young people in London?
So there's a huge number of things that are important for young people. Some of them are things which overlap with what's an issue for Londoners sort of more broadly. But we think that three of the key issues are housing and problems with housing, problems with transport, particularly public transport and cycling, and also problems of access to green spaces and sort of air pollution and the quality of air in the capital.
Fantastic. So those are three pretty big subjects. So if we take them one by one, so housing, transport and green spaces, starting with housing, what are the issues fundamentally for young people with housing in London?
Yeah, so I think there's generally just this imbalance of power between landlord and renters. You know, we as young people are pretty much forced into the rental market due to the ridiculously high cost of property in London. So, I mean, I had a little look what I could afford the other day, and it didn't get much beyond a parking space at the minute in London. So, you know, we are forced into this market where we are renters paying extortionate amounts of money to landlords to basically pay off their mortgages, line their pockets. And a lot of young people don't know their rights. They have to accept these high prices for, you know, quite often substandard accommodation. And they get involved in these disputes where they don't really know how to tackle these situations. So I think it's just, you know, we need to have better rights first and foremost and be more aware of our rights. And I think that's something that young people, we really need to focus on, seeing as we're trapped in this horrible renting game in London.
Thank you, George. I think that's so important that young people really, really know their rights. It's been good to see that the Young Greens have been running campaigns around that. Lucy, how about you? What are the issues for young people in housing?
So yeah, like George said, one of the problems is about the private rented sector and the huge prices and also the low quality of housing in the private sector. But another problem, which is on a completely different level, is the number of young Londoners who live in temporary accommodation or who may be living in overcrowded housing, perhaps with their families, where there's just so many people in a property that just is not suitable for that number of inhabitants. And that's just a completely different scale of problem, especially with lockdown. Like, can you imagine having to spend that in a place where a home that, you know, is just temporary or is, you know, so full and busy? It would be horrendous. And I think sort of it's something that could solve both the problem of the private rented sector and the problem of temporary accommodation and overcrowding is sort of either like rent controls and things like that, but also things like just investing in social housing so that you know, low cost, good quality housing is available for everyone.
Again, agree entirely. I think investing in social housing is something that we talk about a lot, but just doesn't seem to happen. So really hoping that'll happen in the future. And the stats often show that it's worse now for young people than it ever has been in terms of the housing market. How true does that feel for you?
Yeah, it definitely feels true for me. You know, I talked to my parents, both of them worked for the NHS, and when they were my age, they had mortgages on houses. And I don't imagine that there are many 24-year-olds who work for the NHS that can afford a mortgage now on any kind of property. That just seems completely unimaginable, let alone if you're in a less stable job or a precarious job. You know, it seems worse than ever.
Right. So moving on from housing just temporarily to George, what are the issues around transport and young people?
Yeah, I think obviously transport prices are not low enough. So, you know, there's not much distinction between taking the tube and perhaps driving around, which from an environmentally friendly perspective it isn't good enough. You know, that should be the cheapest option. Also, you know, kind of adding to air pollution and stuff like that within London, which is already horribly polluted. So public transport should be the lowest option, and it's just not that at the minute. Another option should be cycling to work. I think cycle lanes, there are some good ones, and I know there are plans to kind of change these, but at the minute, they aren't really accessible to every person who might be keen to cycle. I recently bought a bike, for example, and I don't feel entirely safe cycling around my area. I live not too far from kind of Finsbury Park Green Lanes area, and there are no cycle lanes on many of the roads around there, which makes it very difficult if you're not confident enough to be going on the roads. So I think there definitely needs to be a look at how we can redesign London for the cyclist, even those who perhaps aren't as used to cycling on the busy roads, not only from environmental perspectives, also for health reasons. It's great to kind of, you know, be active going to work, and for cost as well, because as we've already mentioned, we're already trapped in this horrible kind of renters situation where it's so expensive to live in London. We don't want the added expense of hundreds and hundreds of pounds at a time to be travelling to and from work as well. So I think now, particularly given the coronavirus crisis and the fact more of us are working from home than ever, there's never going to be a better opportunity to really think about how we want to redesign London. And I think cycling has to be at the heart of that redesign.
It lifts my heart whenever I hear anyone say that they've just bought a bike and they're slowly getting more confident. And also, though, it's a very familiar story to hear that they can be scared cycling on the roads. And I agree. I think if now, during a respiratory pandemic, is not the time where we fix our roads and make sure that they're more cycle-friendly, then when is ever going to be the time? So I'm really glad to see Greens all over London pressurising the councils and lobbying for this. Lucy, I believe you're a young cyclist. How is that for you?
Yeah, I've been cycling probably for about 4 or 5 years now. I previously, that's been in places where it's quite easy to cycle, like Brighton, or I lived in the Netherlands for a year. It's a lovely experience. You know, it has its problems, but it's not too bad. And then last year I moved to London, and even as a fairly confident cyclist, it's a new kind of terrifying, like trying to tackle cycling here. You know, just the fact that you're just weaving between buses and taxis is a normal part of being a London cyclist, especially if you're commuting. And I just think if I'm scared of it, and if, you know, I feel like I'm, you know, taking my life in my hands to get around Elephant and Castle, that how scary that must be for people who are less confident. And we need to just be building roads and like infrastructure that encourage people onto their bikes, you know, whether you're confident or not confident, you know, whether you're, so that children and older people as well want to cycle, and it's not just kind of this narrow demographic of like fit, healthy, often sort of like white middle class men who have a fancy bike. We want everyone to be doing it, and for everyone to feel comfortable doing it, and not feel like, you know, it's a really dangerous thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also quite grim that Elephant and Castle, that's the, excuse me, Elephant and Castle is the new improved cycling area too, and it's still not good enough, so that needs to improve. I live just near the Euston Road, which is one of the most polluted roads in Europe, and actually they've just put in a cycle lane, and it is a marked improvement. Work still needs to be done, but you can just feel the difference when you're cycling. I'm going to come on to George in a moment to talk about green spaces. Just before I do, I just want to remind anyone watching that if they've got any questions for Lucy or George, or any of the issues or comments about being a young green in London, then please do put them in the chat box. We've got a comment already from Vivian Lichtenstein, who is the chair of the Jewish Green, and she's saying, as part of No Space of Hate, for the next 48 hours, our Twitter account will be exclusively run by Jewish young Greens. So it's really, really good to hear that the young Greens are stepping forward with that and giving their Twitter account over to Jewish people for 48 hours. Thank you for that and for the solidarity. Handing over to George now, issues with green space and young Londoners.
Yes, I think there are so many kind of intersectional environmental and social issues in London at the minute. You know, we have the worst air pollution in the UK. I think 8 of the top 10 worst areas for air pollution in the UK are in London. So that's obviously a big issue for our city. And when you kind of break down those areas that are worse polluted by, you know, World Health Organization standards, these are often the most non-white communities in the UK as well. So places like Newham and Brent. So environmental racism and classism is just a huge issue in London that we need to be aware of, and pushing for change on that front. I think lockdown during the coronavirus crisis kind of highlighted how important green spaces are for kind of mental health well-being as well. You know, mental health crisis among young people is at an all-time high, particularly with, you know, massive unemployment during the coronavirus crisis as well. You know, these are 2 massive national issues that aren't just located to London. So it's really important we protect our green spaces as well, on that side of thing, as well as for people's health due to air pollution.
Well said, thank you. And Lucy?
And yeah, I also think it's important that when we're talking about protecting green spaces, this isn't just about protecting these areas that everyone values and everyone knows are beautiful, like, you know, Hampstead Heath or Brockwell Park. it's also about protecting spaces that might not seem that, you know, like these wonderful places of nature, but they could be the only outdoor space that some of those people who live near it have access to. I know there's an example in Southwark of, I think it's called Greendale Fields, which is just an area of AstroTurf that is potentially going to have some flats built on it. And as much as that is, you know, that's not the ideal piece of nature that people should have access to, but for people who live in the council estates next to it, that is their area for children to go out and play and for them to have outdoor space. And so that is still a piece of, you know, sort of a green space, whether that's, you know, actually nature or something like AstroTurf, is still an important thing to protect. And just, yeah, when there's so little space in London, we really need to cling on to what we have.
For sure. And sticking with you, Lucy, so recently elected as a London Young Green co-chair, we've just done a whistle-stop tour of some of the horrendous problems going on in London and some of the challenges. What can we do about it, both as London Young Greens, a Green Party, and generally citizens in London?
I think as the London Young Greens, that what we want to do is try and bring together all of these voices that are calling for, you know, in the wake of coronavirus, we're talking about building back better. And so we want to bring together the voices calling for a London which is greener and fairer, but which is also specifically greener and fairer for young people. I think that too often in the past few months in a response to coronavirus, it's felt like young people's voices haven't been heard, that the rules and things which have been brought in aren't relevant to how we live our lives at the moment. And so I think we really just want to make sure that young people's voices are part of that conversation, and we want to work with other groups that have similar values as us and are working towards similar things, and yeah, to just really put forward the campaigns that we want, and to like have this, you know, vision of the London that we could have, because I think there's so much like demand to see change now.
Absolutely. And George, same question to you. What can the London Young Greens do?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Lucy said. I feel there's a real kind of disconnect between the youth and kind of traditional mainstream politics. You know, I think this is the first generation really, and I describe myself as kind of a pensioner of the Young Greens, because I'm really at the top end, even though I'm a relatively recent member of the Young Greens. I'm definitely like older than a lot of people in there who are these really young, passionate activists who've grown up surrounded by a completely different landscape, I think, even compared to me 10 years ago. You know, social media is so all-consuming now, but it means all these young people are so aware of issues more than I think ever before, compared to perhaps our parents' generation, where, you know, you might pick up a newspaper or you watch a bit of TV, a bit of the news on TV, you get a very kind of focused narrative. Whereas now I think young people are seeing wider issues, they care about it, they're passionate. And that kind of sense of urgency, whether it be about climate issues or social issues, that doesn't really translate on the main political stage. There's a lot of kind of status quo that doesn't really tap into this urgency, this desperation that a lot of young people feel because they're terrified about their futures. And I think it's really, really important in our role that we are the voice and we help amplify these voices that perhaps don't get the mainstream coverage, that we challenge the party, the older members there. And we try and get these voices into mainstream politics, because these guys are the future. I'm so excited and proud of some of our members and what they're already doing. I think it's really important that we all just put them forward and create a platform for them. So hopefully Lucy and I can help bring about that as well.
Thank you. I feel pretty inspired, and like our Young Green Party, London Young Greens are in pretty safe hands. So thank you both very much for all the work you've done and also all the work you're about to do, I'm sure. So moving gears slightly, I want to introduce Naranee Ruthra-Rajan, who's from A New Direction. A New Direction are a youth organisation, or an organisation, a non-profit that work with young people to unlock their creativity. It particularly specialises in bridging the gap between the cultural sector and the education sector. Now, we've been talking about the political element here. What I'm really interested in talking to Naranee about is how can organisations like hers bridge the gap or fill the space in some of the issues we've just been talking about?
So, for A New Direction, our focus is very much on the arts and creativity. What George and Lucy have said most recently just now about youth voice is a really important issue for us, and we think the arts are an incredible way of doing that, of developing young people's voice. So we do work with teachers, for example. So in February, we did an event with the London Bubble Theatre, who have this great programme called Speech Bubbles, and a dance organisation called Challenge 59, which is all about young people having opportunities to, it helps the teachers then go back to their classrooms and develop young people's ability to speak up for themselves, recognise when they want to, and find ways of doing that, and also having the confidence to do that. It's amazing to hear that there's so many young Greens who do have that confidence, but it's not necessarily something that all young people feel, and it's not necessarily the experience all young people have of education that teachers want to develop this. It's not an inevitable part of our current education system, but luckily there are lots of teachers who want to do that, and we try and support them to do that and to find ways to work with the cultural sector that help them do that. We've redirected a lot of our work towards wellbeing in particular over lockdown for obvious reasons. And in the autumn, we're going to be focusing on a recovery curriculum that's been developed by Oxford Brookes University and coming up with activities from different artists that will support teachers to try those activities back in their classroom.
Like a lot's going on. And kind of, I guess, in terms of a final question, in terms of wrapping up, where do you want to see things go in the future, or what do organisations like your organisation need?
I think it's continuing to work with the cultural sector. It's not the easiest time for them, as you know, but I think there are some efforts to try and support them and try and do as much as possible to support teachers and other organisations as well. We work with virtual schools for children in care, but doing as much as we can to empower young people so they can feel like they are part of this city and they have a voice in this city.
Perfect. And in terms of if people want to find out more, where's the best place that people can find out more, both about A New Direction and about you, Naranee?
You can find out about me on the organisation website, A New Direction. So that has all the different programs we run. One thing I haven't mentioned is we also have an employability team. It's called Create Jobs. They run this programme, and that's all, which hopefully will help address some of the youth unemployment issues that is going to be facing us, already are facing us during lockdown and going forward, which will help young people access the creative and cultural sector, which has particular access needs.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. I know it was short and brief, but really, really helpful to have your voice in the conversation. Thank you. You can also find out about George and Lucy and the London Young Greens. They're all on Twitter. Not until tomorrow, obviously, until 9 a.m. when the boycott's over. I would be remiss to end the programme about young Londoners without talking about the work that Sian Berry, our candidate for mayor, has been doing on the London Assembly. In 2016, I believe, lots of young people were coming up to her during the election and saying that there was nothing there for them, that youth services were being cut. Sian found that there just wasn't a central place where that kind of information was being stored, so she did lots of investigation and commissioned a report. When she actually found out in the first report in 2017 and another report this year that over £100 million have been cut from youth services. Now, that's obviously devastating for young people, it's devastating for people whose services are being cut. But it's also the holistic impact this has on things like social care. And I remember her saying to the mayor that if you were going to spend £100 million on youth services, people would expect that to be a lot of money and make a huge difference. So just imagine what it's going to feel like for them now that it's been removed. The mayor, to his credit, did take that on, and the next year set up a Young Londoners Fund. I think it was £17 million, and it's growing more. It's still not enough, but that's, again, the pressure that a Green can have in the room. And Sian will continue that amazing work and valuable work on pushing to bring our youth services back, because they're needed now more than ever. As always, not nearly enough time to talk about the things that we need to talk about. But hopefully that's got your minds whirring and we can continue the conversation online. Thank you so much for watching Zip Over to Zack's. Thank you so much to Naranee, to George, to Lucy. And also I want to say thank you to Frankie Mills, who's behind the scenes. She's the one that produces the show and works incredibly hard. Thank you for all that you've done, Frankie. Thank you very much, and see you next Tuesday.
Victoria